for the kind words of being interested in this work personally, as well as just a fun opportunity to kind of talk professionally and share with you all about some of the work. So, as Kristen mentioned, I'm Brian Harvey. I am associate professor in CEFS here, and it's kind of fun. We're just talking about interviews that we're doing in CEFS right now, and I recently gave a seminar in CEFS as part of our seminar series, and it's the first one I had done here on campus, I think, since I have been tenured. So it's fun to not be like giving a job talk, but now giving a like, hey, this is what I've been up to for the last 6 years talk. So this is a little bit of a flavor of that with some quantitative things sprinkled in for sure. So really quick before diving in here, let's see, assuming we can dive in, there we go. Quick introduction to the really awesome people who do a lot of the hands-on work here. This is my lab group, my current lab group, and none of the work that I'm presenting today would be possible without folks in the current lab group, as well as alums of the lab group. And then a lot of the work that we do is, as Kristen mentioned, pulling field data and using that across scales with a lot of geospatial tools and remote sensing analyses. And so collecting those field data on the ground is a huge part of this. So a huge debt of gratitude to folks who are involved in that, as well as a long list of collaborators, many of whom you'll see sprinkled out throughout the talk today, and then also funders and supporters who have really been tremendous and generous in supporting and engaging with us on this work. So realize I'm in SAFS right now. I am coming from CEFS, and so just kind of setting the scene, really big picture zoomed out. Probably not a surprise to any of you here, even though we're in the SAFS building, that just as fish are ingrained in the identity of the Pacific Northwest, so are forests, right? When we think about the Pacific Northwest, most people around the world think about scenes like this old growth forest on the west side of the Cascades, or on the west side of the Olympic Peninsula, where we've got enormous, among the highest biomass forests in the world with enormous trees in them, this green, lush landscape. And I just like to highlight, I am a diehard baseball fan. And so last year was a collision of two of my favorite things in one place, which was the All-Star game for the major leagues in Seattle. And just highlighting that almost every cultural icon of the Pacific Northwest or Seattle has something having to do with forests in it, right? So they're really, really, really ingrained in our identity, as is, believe it or not, and might come to a surprise to a lot of folks who haven't been living in the Northwest for a while, that fire is also a big part of these landscapes and has been here for a long, long time. So even though to us, oftentimes we hear about things like the smoke, or we feel the smoke, or smoky skies, and it's in the headlines since 2017 and onward, feels like a new phenomenon. Absolutely couldn't be further from the truth. Fire has been part of these landscapes since as long as land plants have been on these landscapes, and people have been interacting with fire for as long as people have been here. And so that is a very long time. We're talking about hundreds of millions of years, and also tens of thousands of years, or potentially 10,000 years plus, that humans have been here and interacting with fire on these landscapes. However, forests, fire, integral to these landscapes. But when we start thinking about some of the trends recently with a warming climate and escalating fire activity, there's a repeated question that keeps coming up, whether it's in the scientific realm, whether it's in the public discourse, whether it's in the policy and management discourse, of, are forests doing okay? Here we're looking at a map on the left-hand side, which easily could be interpreted or misinterpreted as a map of forested area in the northwestern states here. But that purple area is actually all of the area that wildfires have occurred over the last few decades. So in other words, it's getting harder and harder to find an area that hasn't burned recently than one that has burned recently. And again, some of that might be totally normal. Some of that might be catalyzing shifts from forests to non-forest types of ecosystems here. So this is a scene from in the northern Rocky Mountains, not unlike many that you've probably seen across the western US, where there's been a high severity fire that has yet to be followed by any post-fire tree regeneration. And so there's a big question of, with all of this fire being thrown at them and a warming climate, are forests going to be able to tolerate these kind of conditions? And be resilient in the face of multiple stressors. And it's also a question that is high and front and center at all the way up to the White House and Congress, with lots of interest, lots of questions, and lots of investment in this activity around how do we best manage and inform stewardship and management of forests, inform policies that are able to enable that responsible and effective management. So all of this context underlies the main question that forms the research that I do and that we do in my lab group and with our collaborators, which is, how are forest fires and forest resilience to fire changing as the planet warms? So we've got these trends that are occurring. Are things starting to go outside the bounds of the capacity of these forests to be able to tolerate, or are we starting to see things feedback and other mechanisms of resilience perhaps emerge? Now, that's a general question, but even within the Northwest, again, quiz probably people around the world, and they'll think, oh, the Northwest all looks like that picture that we showed there, or it all looks like the icon on the All-Star Game logo from last year. But as we know, forests are wildly diverse across this region. In fact, for lots of different dimensions of why that is an interesting and important and useful thing, we've got this really amazing gradient going from some of the wettest forests in the world to some of the driest forests in the world on the west side and east side of the Cascades. And correspondingly, a lot of variability in the role that disturbances like fire would play in that kind of environment. Corresponding on top of that is a wide variety in the role that humans play in that relationship with forests and fire across this gradient. And so when we think about this question, it's really important to also think about the particular context that it's being asked in, because we might ask the same question and get a totally different answer on either side of the Cascades, for example. So going back to that main question that forms the core of a lot of our research efforts here, there's kind of three themes to how we go about this in my lab group and subtopics that we focus on. One is looking at the drivers and characteristics and effects of something called burn severity or fire severity, which I'll explain a little bit, in this period of rapid fire regime change. So we're literally seeing fire regimes changing and responding to environmental stressors before our eyes. So what are those characteristics, and what are the consequences of those characteristics, is one of the key things that we focus on. When a fire happens, it's also really important to understand the post-fire response trajectory. So the same exact fire might mean two qualitatively different things for what's happening following that fire, or vice versa. You might have two fires that are wildly different, but they eventually have the same pathway. And understanding how forests are going to be responding is a big piece of our lab's research effort. And then not surprisingly, but important to keep on the radar, is that forest fires are rarely ever happening in isolation, right? They're often being coupled with or relating to or linked to other disturbances or other system states prior to that disturbance that might be really important for shaping how that ecosystem is going to respond. So these are three of the focal theme areas that we tackle in our lab group. How do we go about it? Well, as I mentioned in the beginning, as Kristen mentioned, we get down on our hands and knees and get dirty and covered in soot and char, measuring things in the field, both prior to fires as well as at varying times after fires, to be able to anchor all of the insights and data that we're gathering, especially data that is from remote sensors, having that anchored in the ground on what's actually happening here. So we do a lot of very, very, very focused field studies as a part of this. And then we link together those insights from the field with remote sensing data and landscape spatial analyses to ask questions at broader scales and really be able to transcend the insights that we can get from local field studies into scaling all the way up to continental questions about how some of these fire regimes are changing and what the consequences are. So let's go back to the three focal points, and we'll look at some examples and some of the interesting, exciting things we're working on this first one to lead off here. So when we think of a fire, let me ask you all, let's go in the room. when you think of a forest fire, you hear of a forest fire happening. What's the image that comes to mind? What's the first thing that comes to mind? If you're regeneration. All right. All right, cool. We're already a couple steps ahead on that one.
Mine was Smokey the Bear.
Okay, Smokey the Bear regeneration. What about like we hear about like this area last year in Canada, right? How many tens of millions of hectares have burned in the last few years in Canada, right? What's your image of what those landscapes look like?
Flat, charred, ash fields.
Okay, there we go. Thank you. We got to it. And I really appreciate all of the steps ahead. You guys are already several steps ahead of me. But oftentimes, right, we get this idea of fire happens, especially a big fire that is this homogeneous moonscape out there. But over and over and over and over again in fire ecology, it has been demonstrated almost as an absolute rule rather than the exception that fires are extraordinarily heterogeneous, right? And that heterogeneity, that spatial mosaic of high severity areas, low severity areas, unburned islands within a fire is absolutely critical to the mechanisms of resilience and recovery and regeneration following a fire. And that's been shown in lots and lots and lots of examples going back to still to this day, the largest fire on record in the Northern Rockies is the 1988 Yellowstone fires that demonstrated tremendous heterogeneity. But with some of the recent fires, like the 2020 Labor Day fires that happened in the Cascades, there's this question all over again of, whoa, look at these. Look at how homogeneous that burned landscape is. And are we seeing those patterns changing? Are we seeing the consequences of those patterns changing unfold before our eyes? So a lot of the work that we do is, again, building insights from the field measures that we can quantify how severely a fire is burning, and then connecting that with satellite indices to be able to actually track the spatial patterns, the spatial configuration of burn severity, to be able to understand the characteristics, drivers, and consequences of that. And so one of the things we're currently working on is building on some previous work where we take those field measures, take a satellite index. In this case, this is the relative difference normalized burn ratio, or RDMBR, which is basically, for simple terms, a pre-fire and post-fire image that is tuned to vegetation indices and is particularly sensitive to fire-caused changes, and then subtracts those to get a difference map, right? And these have been used for a very long time to map fires, but what they actually mean on the ground has still been elusive for a lot of different metrics. And so one of the current things that we're working on is building on some previous work where taking those field measures, building better models with these satellite indices, and then mapping actual effects of burn severity. In this case, basal area killed by fire, or a proxy of tree biomass killed by fire, or charred surface cover. How much of the ground cover is actually charred versus unburned? And as you can see here, what's really interesting and important about that is that the same exact satellite index map actually translates to two kind of qualitatively different burn severity mosaics, depending on which measure of burn severity you're trying to map. Now, as a quantitative seminar, you'd also be happy to know that it's important to embrace the uncertainty around those estimates, right? There are some pretty messy relationships between those field and satellite indices, and at best we're getting R squares in the ballpark of 0.65, 0.75, right? So there's some uncertainty around that, not bad for a satellite index, but actually quantifying that uncertainty to be able to map something like the predicted 95th or 5th quantile of the data for that response variable is again important, because that might give you a qualitatively different view of what's happening in that landscape, or at least knowing how variable that might be. And all of the downstream spatial metrics that we might calculate are going to be affected by that uncertainty, and also by the difference in those relationships among variables.
What model is underlying those spatial patterns? There's so many different ways of modeling landscape from field data and satellite. What are you using?
Yeah, these are so these are like on a couple different ways to think about that. first off, these are just pixel-based models that are paint by number back on the maps, right? So there's no spatial information. It's just throwing all of the field plot data with their corresponding pixel estimate of that burn severity into this. And then these are 0-1 inflated Bayesian regression models in this particular example here. But we've used the 0-1 inflated beta regression models for a lot of these that are bound as a proportion estimate. Okay, so we can do that. And that's important because this is a big thing that we need to be doing better job of actually mapping actual effects and not just the satellite index on the ground. And then another thing that we're doing is knowing when the past scale of a particular index is no longer capturing what we're seeing on the field. So these are two different examples of burned areas. Both of these would be 100% stand replacing high severity fire, right? Meaning high severity, there's a lot of change from pre to post fire, and stand replacing, meaning everything was killed. All the tree biomass was killed. And most of our satellite indices and most of our field measurements, at least that have been developed in the last few decades, have been tuned on conditions like this, where this is about as severe as it gets, because that's all you needed to do, right? So there's a composite burn index, which is measured in the field, that goes from 0 to 3, and this is like a 3.0. That's a problem when we start to see burn severity showing up like this, where this was actually a fully forested landscape prior to the fire, and what you're seeing is all of those little stubs and nubs coming off the ground were the base of the tree stems, where everything else was consumed and combusted. So if we have satellite indices and field indices that are capping out at their maximum at here, we need to start asking if we're seeing conditions that are, to borrow the analogy from Spinal Tap, turning it to 11, right? We need an amplifier that goes up to 11 now. And so Saba Saberi was a master's student in my lab and is currently a PhD student at UC Davis, who helped develop some models that actually start to recalibrate based on some of these extreme burn severity conditions that we're seeing around there. So I'll come back to that example in some of our work looking at the spatial patterns of burn severity in some of these extreme reburn areas shortly. But it's also really, really useful to have these indices to then start filling in the map, particularly in areas where we haven't seen fires up until recent years. So a lot of our research in my lab group is focused particularly on the west side of the Cascades. And this is an area where historically we know fire has played a really big role in these forests, but it's a relatively infrequent and higher severity fire regime than in other parts of the West. And so even in the last 100 years, there hasn't been a ton of fire activity until a couple of fires starting to show up since the last decade or so, and particularly so in the 2020 Labor Day fire events, right? So some of our work is characterizing, actually for the first time, because there's now data to analyze this in this region, the spatial characteristics of burn severity in the Western Cascades here. So what we did, we took, wanted to ask a question of what's going on, particularly in these fires that are really large and kind of surprising from a societal standpoint, that may or may not be part of this historical regime. And what we found is that it's a really interesting fire regime here, and that from 1984 to 2020, about 250,000 hectares, or about 600,000 acres have burned, most of that at high severity. So this is a high severity regime, but interestingly, only about 50% of it burned at high severity. Most of it is not high severity fire, which was one of the surprising things we found here. But the 6 largest fires that all occurred from 2017 to 2020, all were driven by late summer east wind events. So our kind of northwest version of the Santa Ana winds, like they get in Southern California, accounted for 88% of the total area burned and 88% of the stand replacing area burned. So they really carry a lion's share of the amount of change that's happening due to fire on these landscapes. And some of those fires, particularly in the 2020 Labor Day fires, produced some very large high severity patches. And so again, there's this big concern of, are we starting to see system dynamics that are now kind of outside the bounds of what we've even seen in terms of large standard placing patches? Are we starting to see burned landscapes that are turning a little bit more into these blackened moonscapes versus this heterogeneous mosaic? And so this is actually standing in the middle of a single patch of high severity fire that is a contiguous area adding up to 24,000 hectares of a single patch of standard placing area where all of the trees were killed. 12 individual standard placing patches account for almost all of the standard placing area on the west side of the Cascade. So it's a system that is really strongly characterized by these infrequent, large, and sort of extraordinarily impactful in terms of shaping the landscape events. And it's easy to get the idea that if we just summed up that area, that's going to cause some serious challenges for post-fire tree regeneration on the landscape, to go back to Andre's point and initial thought of what might be important. So if we think about a given landscape, like this is the Eagle Creek fire. Some of you might have seen this if you're driving along I-84 on the south side of the Columbia River. This is right on the Oregon side, and it was a big fire that burned in 2017. And what we're looking at here is all of the less than standard placing fire in blue, and then the standard placing fire in yellow here. And you might get an idea that, wow, a lot of those areas are actually really far from seed sources if they've got to disperse from the outside of those burn patches to get in there and reseed. However, if you actually look at the cumulative distance to seed source by actually playing that out spatially on the map, you get a very different picture of what the regeneration or resilience of this landscape might look like following a fire. In fact, across all of those fires on the west side of the Cascades, even those very large ones that included some of the that 24,000 hectare single patch, just within the standard placing burned area alone, greater than 50% of that is within 120 meters from a live forest. And that is a pretty easy distance for something like a 100-meter tall Douglas fir tree to disperse seeds out into. So most of the area that is standard placing, which is only about half of the area that's burned, is well within striking distance of seed sources. And it's only about 15% of the standard placing area, or roughly 7.5% of the total burned area overall, because remember, half of the area was not standard placing, that is really far from a seed source. And in fact, believe it or not, on the west side of the Cascades, as much as we know and love old growth forests and think of them as the most rare and imperiled ecosystem, complex early cereal post-fire environments are by far a way more limited in supply ecosystem condition than even old growth forests are. So some of these areas are actually providing critical biodiversity by virtue of being way out in the middle of a high severity patch and not being immediately dominated by trees following a fire. So using some of these kind of conceptual relationships, what you can do is have an awesome quorum PhD student who is now Dr. Bonaducci, focus some of their PhD on this. And Michelle Bonaducci really took this stuff to the next level with, in my opinion, boiling down in very simple and useful terms, ways that we can take scaling relationships between fire size and stand replacing area and configuration to get some really innovative ways to analyze how these patterns are changing across space and time in the Western US. And so what Michelle did to ask this question of how these regimes are changing over time and space is asked, what's the relationship between fire size and these different measures of distance to seed source and area weighted mean patch size, and look at how that scaling relationship is potentially changing over time and space. And one of the really interesting things was it's not changing a whole lot. As fire regimes are changing, this stability and at least for the time, stationarity in this relationship was pretty remarkable in that it gives us a lot of power to ask questions like, what might burn severity patterns look like in the future? Because as long as that relationship remains fairly stationary, we have good projections of total area burned in the future. We have good projections of even fire size distributions in the future based on fire climate modeling and some of the broader scale drivers. And so we can actually harness that information to start painting on those landscapes what the probable spatial configuration of burn severity might be, until or unless those scaling relationships start to break down, which at what point they do, there's a whole host of really interesting questions of what is behind that non-stationarity and feedback in that scaling relationship. So just a huge shout out to the work that Michelle has done on this. And for me, like Michelle was my first introduction into the Quorum program and learning about the Quorum program, and has been somebody who has, really opened my eyes to the awesomeness of the Quorum program and the quantitative sciences group more broadly on campus here. So we're still doing a lot of work continuing on this, and Michelle's, through part of her postdoc work, is continuing to collaborate on some additional pieces that are building on this.
What is quantitative program missions?
Done it in the past. I'll do it again. We'll save that for after we're out of time questions. Okay. So then we can ask questions like, what do management treatments on particular landscapes do to the landscape patterns of burn severity, right? So we have a current project through the Joint Fire Science Program, which is looking at, here's some pre-treatment landscapes with the eventual treated areas sort of in polygon form here. Here's what they look like after that treatment, where they've gone through and done a lot of thinning and reduction of the fuels in those areas. And then here's what the landscape looks like just from a satellite shot of the post-fire landscape, just to give you an idea of kind of visually what this looks like. And so we have a current project that's basically asking not just what the local scale change in burn severity might be, but what's the actual spatial effect of those treatments in terms of changing the spatial patterns of burn severity and like actually changing the heterogeneity of burn severity, given that heterogeneity is that really critical ecosystem dimension of resilience. In a project that is just getting going and continuing to build, we're also scaling some of this to the Western US. This is a really exciting project that's the Western Fire and Forest Resilience Collaborative, which is supported by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. It includes several universities across the US and different lab groups tackling different components of this. So a lot of the work that I just presented is some of the work that we're leading on the tracking forests and fire piece, and then linking that to field experiments, simulation models, ecosystem services, and then with a community of practice, which is a lot of folks in different land management agencies. So it's a really cool opportunity to kind of scale some of this up to really help inform some of those big picture federal level questions about how we can start to bend the curve on some of these trends in fire activity and consequences for forests. Okay. So when a fire happens, then the post-fire regeneration or trajectory pathway is also a really important and critical piece of understanding how forests might be resilient to fire and a warming climate. And this is particularly important at a critical transition stage when you've got a high severity or stand replacing fire, right? You could think about all sorts of things that a large mature tree might be able to endure and persist through different stressors, that all of a sudden, now that tree is dead, it's regenerating via seed, and you've got extraordinarily fragile organisms and individuals of those tree seedlings that are now experiencing a very different environment than their parents might have. Particularly important when you have forests that are characterized by long intervals between stand replacing disturbances. So when I started here at UW, one of the pieces of advice from my PhD advisor, my postdoc advisor, and one of my mentors here at UW was to invest in long-term field studies. And so I had gotten a little bit of a experience and flavor of this from working with two of these people in my PhD and my postdoc, and then really hammering this point home, working with and learning from Jerry Franklin here about particularly in ecosystems that are characterized by infrequent disturbance dynamics and trajectories that unfold over a very long time, that just sometimes trusting that if you're continuing to take repeated measurements, something interesting and important is going to happen along the way, and you'll be able to answer some really important and valuable questions that you would have kicked yourself for not having those data if you didn't otherwise invest in that. So when I started here, teamed up with two close collaborators now at the Washington DNR, Dan Donato and Josh Solofsky, and we started investing in these post-fire field measurements, particularly on the west side of the Cascades and some of the areas that had started to burn in the first couple of years that I had been here. And then in 2020, and I promise we had nothing to do with the opportunity that arose, but in 2020, that sort of got cranked to 11 once again, where all of a sudden, this was up on the radar of everybody in the region now interested and concerned about what's happening following these fires on the west side of the Cascades. So we've been doubling down our efforts to go out and continue to measure and collect data on this. And I'll share a little bit about what we're collecting and what some of those insights are, but just also point to the fact that this is a really, really awesome and humbling project to be involved in, with lots of different partners and diverse perspectives that are being represented on this, where we're collaboratively asking questions about the drivers, the characteristics, and the effects of fires in the Northwestern Cascades. So I shared a little bit about some of the burn severity patterns piece. Crystal Raymond at the Climate Impacts Group and Nick Bond and Karen Bumbaco at the Washington State Climatology Office are leading up pieces where we're looking at the climate and weather drivers piece. And I'm going to particularly focus on the post-fire ecosystem response piece here, because this is where we've been really continuing to invest in that network of plots that we've been setting up. And it's really impressive. I feel like all the work that the folks that I showed at the beginning have been doing the on-the-ground work, installing these plots, is really starting to pay off. And that we've now got 175 plots. Each one of those plots is a full hectare plot that has the design that resembles the blueprints for the Death Star in Star Wars Episode 4. But it's basically just to show you that we measure a bunch of different response variables and subplots that are measuring everything from what the forest looked like prior to the fire, the burn severity or fire effects, post-fire tree regeneration, the entire post-fire plant community to species, post-fire coarse woody debris and snags, post-fire woody carbon, and then post-fire fuel profiles to understand how these areas might burn or what the risk of reburning might be. And importantly, these are all permanently monumented plots with the idea that they're going to be resampled at intervals throughout successional time. And so we're really just kind of on the first part of this relay race with these, and just starting to next year revisit plots and get the second sample on them.
You're not able to sample the animals in the plots, things like what's going on in the substrate and insects and stuff like that?
We are, so yeah, what I would say is actually take this slide as an invitation for anybody who wants to add on complementary. Yeah, I've been reaching out to, and there's some folks who are interested in adding some of those complementary measurements on there. But yeah, I mean, these are literally like a huge resource for people to add on any of those complementary dimensions. Literally, for us, we're pretty focused on the forest structure and fire relevant pieces. But yeah, below ground, above ground, biosurveys of everything going on and environmental conditions would be really cool to tack onto this. So for us, we are focused on some of the critical indicators of post-fire ecosystem response. And three current lab members are focused on looking at the post-fire tree regeneration, early sterile plant communities, and above ground woody carbon in these plots. I'll walk you through some of the work that Madison, Liliana, and Jenna are respectively leading on those, really as three different and complementary dimensions of understanding how the ecosystem is responding and what the consequences might be for post-fire forest cover, biodiversity, and carbon and reburn potential. So we're really interested in asking not just how are they responding, but also how are they responding across these really important gradients of pre-fire condition or the ecosystem state prior to the disturbance, and then the disturbance severity. So we've got plots across this entire matrix of young, mid-seral, late seral prior to the fire. So basically like early plantation all the way to old growth forests, and then whether they were unburned, low severity, or high severity when they happened. And that really gives us an idea of the ingredients going into the fire and the filter from that disturbance of what comes out the other end as two ideas of what we think are going to be fairly important. So Madison's work is tackling the post-fire tree regeneration piece. Just a plug for this. This was just highlighted in the UW Today, I think 2 days ago. Madison had one of her first author papers come out on this. And one of the really interesting findings from this was that not only was post-fire tree regeneration surprisingly high, or at least compared to other ecosystems where you've yet to see post-fire trees establishing decades following fire, but it was really strongly shaped by the pre-fire forest age. So in other words, the older the forest and the more potential seed source there might have been prior to the fire, the more abundant the post-fire tree seedling response was, and the more diverse that post-fire tree seedling response was. So younger stands that burned, earlier seral stands that burned often were dominated by just Douglas fir post-fire. However, if it was an older growth stand that burned, it was more dominated evenly by different species, including some of the otherwise thought to be kind of later successional species. Also really important, not surprisingly for an ecosystem response, is the pre-fire stand age on the post-fire woody carbon, right? So if you have more biomass going into a fire, more of that is going to be able to persist and make it through that fire as legacy wood that's not consumed or combusted by that fire. Whereas those young stands have smaller trees, much more susceptible to combustion. It didn't have as much carbon going in either. So burn severity had some of an effect, but the biggest effect on the post-fire woody carbon was actually the pre-fire stand age. So older stands, higher post-fire tree regeneration potential, and then more post-fire carbon that persists as dead woody carbon following that fire. Flip that a little bit, and the early seral plant diversity. So this is a pretty elastic response variable here. These are species that are fairly easy to disperse, lots and lots and lots of adaptations to fire or fire-created conditions in the early seral plant community. Was extremely diverse. There was 214 species that we found overall. 90% of those were found in burn sands, and actually almost 40% of those, or 82 species, were found only in burn stands, meaning that burned areas are not just important for diversity, but are actually providing unique biodiversity back to this ecosystem. And different than the other response variables, burn severity was actually much more important for driving the post-fire plant community response. So here we're looking at these convex holes are the burn severity classes. So this is high severity. The middle one is unburned, and then this is low severity here. And then the shapes are giving you an idea of the pre-fire stand age. And this is just a graphical representation of the NMDS state space of these plots with differences or distances corresponding to dissimilarity in the plant community composition. And basically what you see here is that big pink hole there is where it's providing greater and unique diversity in terms of the post-fire plant community that was not present in a lot of these areas prior to the fire, and a much stronger effect of burn severity than the pre-fire stand age. Likely because burn severity is the biggest thing that's important for kind of wiping the slate clean and changing the environment for a lot of these different species. So what we're learning so far, post-fire response, pre-establishment, early soil plant communities, forest structure, carbon, really diverse responses and shaped by that heterogeneity in the pre-fire stand structure, the burn severity itself, and the landscape patterns of severe fire. So, in other words, going back to one of the earlier questions, really, really, really heterogeneous responses following even these large fires on the west side of the Cascades, right? In a 24,000 hectare patch of high severity, there is a tremendous amount of diversity in each of those response variables, depending on where you are in the patch, what the pre-fire forest looked like in the patch, and how far you might be from a seed source from a surviving area. Just a really quick plug, we're doing some similar questions on a network of plots on the east side of the Cascades. And so Angie Leota, who's a newer grad student in the lab working on this data set, still results to be coming out of this, but this is a really interesting context to be looking at post-fire tree regeneration now on the east side of the Cascades, where we go all the way from cold energy limited forests in terms of plant productivity being limited by the length of the growing season, all the way down to dry water limited forests where plant productivity is limited by the amount of moisture during the growing season. So TBD on that one. And then, yeah, looking at, a lot of the work that we do is going into and measuring. I talked a lot about the measuring right after a fire. And then a lot of the work that Jerry Franklin has done that we've been collaborating with him on is inheriting a bunch of these old growth plots where we can understand what's happening in old growth forests and kind of backtrack using tree ring records. But we're also using simulation modeling to kind of fill in that middle piece here. And so Jenna Morris and Sophia Prushka in the lab are working with several different partners and collaborators, as well as Rupert Seidel and Christian Bazunas, who have developed and are working on the development team for the model iLand to simulate these trajectories across successional time using the post-fire data and pressing play and going forward, and then using some of the old growth data to rewind the clock and better understand the dynamics of how they got there. All right, so finally, the last piece here, and then I'll wrap up, is understanding interactions between fires and other disturbances, particularly fires that might interact with previous fires. So a lot of the work that we do looks at areas where there's overlapping fires and there's reburns of previous areas, and using typically a common framework in the disturbance ecology world, which is looking at linked versus compound disturbance interactions. And what that means is essentially testing whether two disturbances are linked, meaning one disturbance affects the probability or severity or magnitude of a second disturbance. So the response variable is the second disturbance in a linked disturbance framework, or a compound disturbance coined by Bob Payne here at UW, is whether a disturbance followed by another disturbance, whether or not they're mechanistically linked, if the sort of successive occurrence of two disturbances leads to a qualitatively different outcome, sort of a 1-2 punch, that those punches themselves might not be linked together. So a lot of the work that we've been doing with this is looking at how the two key pieces that are important to answering that question recover or play out over time following one disturbance. So in this case, when one fire happens, the linked part, at least one piece of the linked part, has to do with how quickly post-fire fuels recover, right? So a fire happens, it burns off a lot of fuel, but if those fuels recover very quickly, you might have a very short negative link going back to a neutral. Or if those fuels recover very slowly, you might have a very more protracted negative feedback or negative link between the two disturbances. And then the recovery mechanism or resilience mechanism of that forest, how quickly does it recover? And in this case, this is an obligate seeding species. These are serotinous forests where the seeds are released by fire, but there needs to be enough time for the regenerating trees to accumulate that seed bank before that next fire comes. So in this work, we've kind of looked at the race between, what we call this is the race between the fuels versus the fruits, to see whoever wins would determine the outcome of whether those are linked and or compound disturbances. And this was a lot of the work from Michelle Agne's PhD research. Don Radcliffe is a current grad student who's taking similar kinds of concepts and asking this in drier forests, more frequent fire forests historically, to say, how can we use disturbance ecology frameworks of linked disturbances or compound disturbances to ask how to best apply management treatments out there, right? Can we do a 1-2 punch of thinning plus burning to actually knock back the fuels enough to restore a frequent fire forest fire regime here? And what does that mean in terms of the resilience mechanisms? In this case, giving enough time for those fire resistant trees to grow thick enough bark to survive that next fire before it comes in. So a very applied way of thinking about this disturbance interaction framework. And then finally, one of the things that I'm really interested about, and this is kind of fun because the last time I presented, I think in this seminar series was very early on, and it was like a preliminary, like, hey, what do you think about this piece of this analysis, which is how do multiple disturbances interact spatially? There's a lot of work that is looked at in a given location, how one disturbance might affect another disturbance, either through linked or compound interactions. But actually looking at how they stack up and play out spatially is a little bit less explored in a lot of different phenomenon. And fire is one of those where if we look at, this is the same exact landscape that is burned 2 times. And this is just clipped to the area where these 2 fires overlap, right? So if you took sort of a spatial join of these 2 areas. First fire, you can see the heterogeneity patterns there on the left-hand side. The second fire also produced a lot of heterogeneity. You might walk away thinking, okay, cool, one fire was heterogeneous. Cool, check that box. The next fire, heterogeneous, check that box. But if you don't actually look at how those patterns cumulatively add up on a landscape and shape the cumulative patterns on that landscape, you would come away with a totally different answer. And in this particular case, we have areas now that have burned twice as standard placing in less than 30 years, which is pretty anomalous for this particular ecosystem. And it's exactly where we're seeing some of these extreme burn severity locations stack up. And so this was in a paper a couple of years ago where we characterized what's happening here and why that's important to be able to understand those kind of cumulative disturbances in space. And then it has really important implications for things like distance to seed source, because as you're eroding and nibbling away at the surviving mature forest patches from one fire to the next, again, if you didn't account for the fact that some of that had already been nibbled away in this previous fire, you might get a totally different answer about the recovery capacity of this forest after that second fire. But you get a qualitatively different map of distance to seed source once you account for the fact that that first fire nibbled away a bunch of the potential seed source. And then finally, it might sound like a really weird place to be thinking about this question, but on the west side of the Cascades, believe it or not, even though we've got this infrequent fire regime, up until 2020, when those big fires happened, there had been 2 big historical fires in the documentary record on the west side of the Cascades. One was in 1902, the Yakult burn. One was in 1933, the Tillamook burn. From the time of those fires to 2020, the lion's share of area burned on the west side of the Cascades was within the perimeters of those past 2 fires. So there's a really interesting historical precedent for the potential for fires to be actually positively linked on the west side of the Cascades through positive feedbacks. And so we're testing this in some of Jenna Morris's work and beyond, where we're looking at the fuel profile. So I showed you earlier the carbon questions that Jenna is asking, also looking at that with the fuel profiles in these forests, because there's a whole lot of fuel that is still there, right? These are extraordinarily biomass rich forests. One fire is not going to do a whole lot to blow through that fuel source, but what it does is open things up to where there's much greater temperatures, higher wind speeds, and lower relative humidity. And so a potential for a second fire to actually be greater in a recently burned area than in an old growth forest that is kind of buffered from a hot, warm day in the summer. So that's a little bit of an overview survey of what we're doing. And in the college of the environment, it's pretty well known, I think, for most of us to be really thinking about how we do this science in a, you know, pushing the bounds of knowledge in a scientific way, but also making sure that we are linking that to societal decision making. So a lot of the work that we do is pretty strongly shaped by the sort of Jane Lubchenco social contract of us as environmental scientists, and making sure that we're doing science that is informed by and also helping to support societal decision making. Just point to one really cool example of that recently in King County. They came out with their first ever wildfire risk reduction strategy, and a lot of the work that we've been doing on the west side of the Cascades was iteratively working with King County and helping to support that, and a lot of the science is helping to inform that. So that's cool. With that, huge thanks to all the awesome people that I get to do all this work with. I feel like this is my favorite part of the job, is all of the people, and that's among a lot of other pieces that are favorite parts of the job. And thanks for listening, and happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, we have some time, I think, for a question, and I'll actually take the first one. When you think, and maybe these are early days, when you are looking at the science coming out of your lab that becomes management advice, say to like King County, what are the key uncertainties during the modeling that you're doing or your lab is doing when producing that advice that are really high priority and have the most influence on what the advice sort of looks like? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What are the management advice most sensitive to in terms of the landscape of uncertainties you cope with in your modeling exercises?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a really practical example of that. That's hopefully getting at the question. So one of the examples I showed is one of the things we're testing right now is the effect of fuel treatments on affecting burn severity patterns on the west side of the Cascades. There is an enormous amount of uncertainty around that question, like period, actually exclamation point, because it's a relatively infrequent phenomenon that we don't have a ton of data like we do in other more frequent fire regimes across the Western US to be able to task to that question. So we're going to find some insights from this. But there's also, it's a regime that is really hard to even communicate some of the nuances in it, because we haven't really in recent history seen like the full emergence of all the dimensions of this regime, right? And so it's in that one, it's a little bit less of a like analytical quantitative answer, as more of a just even kind of helping to communicate the uncertainty of ecosystems that are characterized by hard to predict and relative infrequent events. And one of those examples is like trying to find areas on the west side of the Cascades where something like a fuel treatment likely would have an impact, but under certain conditions may have some impact under a broader range of conditions. And then under the sort of tail of the distribution events that we know are really important and infrequent, acknowledging when they may not have any influence, right? And so like an example of like the Eagle Creek fire, which I showed, that one, as well as the Yakult fire in 1902, those fires jumped the Columbia River. And so when we think about something like a fuel treatment for protecting structures, right? Like they're going to have, and they've been shown and are very strong evidence support to show their effect in lots of different conditions. But there are also some conditions under which like the uncertainty around their effect is extremely high, and actually maybe even likely to be like no effect under certain conditions. And so even just like communicating something like that, where like we have a natural human desire to want to be able to do something about all of the things that might come our way and something like a wildfire, but like putting those into kind of bins of probably going to matter for these sorts of things under these conditions, maybe under these conditions, and like better strategies than hoping that that's going to have to work in that condition. Does that?
Yeah, it does.
It's not very quantitative, but
Well,
more.
I got it.
Yeah.
It's 1:30 right now. Helene, would you like to take the last question?
Do you mind?
I don't mind.
I have kind of a policy related human impact, society impact question, relating to your last slide, and we've started hearing more in aquatic sciences as well about carbon offsets and carbon dioxide removal using the oceans. I think we've been hearing for longer in that field about forest-based, nature-based climate solutions. I'm curious, given your findings on how natural these forest fire cycles are, and the importance of longevity in carbon dioxide removal. What are some of your thoughts about whether we, should be giving people or companies or countries carbon offsets by their decision to not deforest a certain area, if it might get burned up in 10 years anyway?
Yeah, that is a really good question. And actually, I would link it a little bit back to Kristen's question too about the uncertainty piece. There's I think there are a lot of assumptions sometimes that can go into those decisions about what that would mean for carbon, right? And the assumption that, well, I mean, sometimes a lot of those decisions are based on live carbon, obviously, as the pool of carbon that is growing, right? But then the assumptions about the longevity of the dead carbon are actually they're hard to read. Well, there's a lot that we need to do to actually learn more and quantify to be able to sort of put bounds around that uncertainty, that I think would probably lead to some pretty surprising outcomes, particularly with like things like black carbon, right? A lot of, you might assume that, okay, if a fire burns like this and this is happening to a tree, that's really bad for that means a lot of carbon got blown off in that fire, and that actually what's left behind is probably a lot more stable and long-term than that carbon, right? But it's actually not well parameterized in a lot of those estimates. So I think a lot to be learned and gained, I think, from better focusing some of those estimates on the carbon piece.
Thank you. Let's thank Brian one more time.
It was great to get some more forestry